welcome to our third Student Success webinar of this season covering critical thinking and research skills. Today, our wonderful presenters are going to be going over how to identify trustworthy and unbiased sources, utilize search engines to get the most out of them, and even touch upon ChatGPT, which has been a hot topic lately. This is going to be super helpful now that we're inching our way towards winter break and final papers are starting to rear their heads again. There's a ton of information to go over, so let's go ahead and get started. Today, I am joined by our resident experts, Sarah Snyder, Henry Price, and Jenna Gilio. So without further ado, I'll pass it on over to them.
Hi, everybody. This is Henry Price. I'm first on the list there, and I will be doing the first portion of this. I'm happy to virtually see everyone out there today. Just as a quick introduction, again, my name is Henry. I'm the senior manager here at Tutor.com and Princeton Review of institutional training and curriculum. I'll soon be joined by Jenna Gilio, our training content manager, as well as Sarah Snyder, who's the director of project management and strategic development. So we all wear a lot of hats, but we really enjoy getting a chance to get in here and talk directly to all of you about things that might be on your mind as you work your way through your academic life. And as Maxine was just previewing or reviewing, these are the various sessions that are part of this series. Becoming a Confident Writer has already been recorded, so you could go find that on YouTube, as well as the study skills and note-taking session. Obviously, critical thinking and research is right now, and in a couple of weeks, we're going to go into much more depth on a topic that actually has come up in each of our webinars already: academic integrity and plagiarism. So look out for the invitation for that. What we will accomplish in this third out of our 4 webinars is we want to talk about how to think critically about the topic of thinking. That's right. We're going to talk about what critical thinking even is and how we can become critical thinkers. We want to talk about how to find sources for our research and identify assumptions and biases and how those can influence our research for better or for worse. We'll spend some time looking at how and where to look for credible sources and how to critically analyze those sources to make sure they're in fact credible and trustworthy. We'll also, as Maxine mentioned, talk about evaluation of responsible uses of AI services such as ChatGPT. Now, I want to preface all of this by saying we are living in a divisive political climate right now, and a lot of what we're going to talk about might seem like we're addressing issues that we're facing in politics. There's never going to not be some kind of overlap, but I want to assure you that while there can be parallels, we'll even mention a couple, what we're talking about really doesn't have anything to do with all of that. What we're here to do is to help you determine what your own thought processes are and should be when you're researching. So again, if you attended other webinars in this series, some of this may overlap a little bit with what you've heard, but there's plenty of new stuff in here too. So let's get started. The first thing we want to talk about is this. What even is critical thinking? Well, by dictionary definition, it's the objective analysis and evaluation of facts to form a judgment. Well, let's pull that apart a little. The key words to note here are analysis and evaluation of facts. And most of us tend to assume we are in fact thinking critically all the time. And at the same time, we tend to assume people we disagree with probably aren't, because after all, if they were, they would have come to the same conclusion we did, right? Well, I would suggest that there may be varying degrees of things wrong with both of the things I just said. Because in reality, most of us tend to believe the things we hear as kids from the people we trust: family, friends, clergy, teachers, media members, without asking a lot of critical questions. And that's fine when we're kids, but it can be very limiting as we grow up and are exposed to new and bigger ideas. At that point, it kind of could go either way. We're used to trusting people, so we keep trusting new people who may not be worthy of that trust, or because we're hearing things that may conflict with the things we grew up with, we start to feel threatened because we're not prepared to consider that the things we grew up with might not be the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so we dismiss all the new stuff. And yeah, I'm saying we, because we all do it. Each of us individually probably isn't thinking as critically as we like to think we are, and people we disagree with are probably thinking a little more critically than we want to give them credit for. So, to bring all of this back to the subject of the day, the quality of the work we produce in school and in our jobs depends precisely on the quality of our thoughts. And excellence in thought is a skill we have to develop, just like any other. We are not born great at it. So, today we want to talk about how to be intentional about critical thinking. What does it take to be a critical thinker? And how does this lead us to be better students and better writers? A critical thinker raises vital questions and problems. Have you ever met someone who was super well read and informed, and maybe you thought, wow, they really know what they're talking about? Well, first, you should ask yourself a critical question. Do they really know it all, or are they just confirming what you kind of already wanted to believe? Now, let's say you're right, and they really do know a lot and have really complex, highly developed ideas on the subject. And that's probably because they at some point asked themselves exactly that same question. Rather than just accepting what they heard or just accepting what they wanted to already believe, or just go searching for sources that confirmed those things, they thought critically. Because when a critical thinker gathers information, rather than accepting or dismissing it based on their own biases, they assess that information objectively. They ask themselves how reliable the information is. They dig deeper to find out whether the source is reliable and whether that source has done enough critical thinking themselves. A critical thinker effectively comes to well reasoned conclusions and solutions. How do you know whether a conclusion is well reasoned or a solution? It's if it's really extreme in one direction or the other, there's a really good chance that either consciously or unconsciously, that source may have filtered out the things that they didn't want to hear or didn't want to include. And that's definitely not critical thinking. But if their position is more nuanced, it includes differing perspective and respects them even when they disagree, well, chances are critical thinking was applied. And that's because a critical thinker thinks open mindedly within alternative systems of thought. One way to recognize whether someone is doing this is how they react when they hear your perspective. Are they genuinely interested, especially when you disagree? That generally means they're not threatened by outside ideas and are comfortable learning new things, which means that there's a better chance that they were behaving that way when they were doing their own research. A critical thinker recognizes and assesses assumptions, implications, and practical consequences as they do their research. Because if they can identify good critical thinking in others, they're probably getting pretty good at applying it themselves. And finally, a critical thinker communicates effectively with others. So rather than trying to manipulate or intimidate people into believing what they believe, or on the opposite end of this spectrum, kind of sitting back and letting others manipulate and intimidate them, remember that person where you thought, wow, this person really knows what they're talking about? Well, that didn't just come from how good their ideas were, but also from how well they got those ideas across. But where do you prefer to fall? Ask yourself this question. Do you want to be the type of person who is knowledgeable and well read, but also wants to hear differing opinions? I'm guessing most of you would say, yeah, sure, I'd like to be. Part of being a critical thinker, then, is knowing your own assumptions. Think of news items you've seen in your news feed recently. Typically, those will fit into one of two categories. You either trust the source, at which point you probably accepted what you read at face value, or you don't trust or don't recognize the source, and at that point, you might have dismissed it just as quickly. Like, yeah, right, no way. Your instincts might be excellent on what sources are trustworthy. I'm not saying you're wrong in your assumptions about everything. Assumption is not wrong. An assumption is unproven at this stage of your research. And in just a few minutes, Jen is going to talk about how to recognize when you're doing that and what sources might be trustworthy. But sometimes we're making assumptions and we don't even realize it. So applying a similar standard of evidence to every source should help neutralize any biases that you may have. As critical thinkers, we need to identify and evaluate our own assumptions before we accept something as the truth. That means we need to follow an argument to its conclusion. I think about how sometimes I read a headline for a news story, but then not the article, which is super lazy, but is also dangerous because at that point you're assuming the headline tells the story. The headline's job actually isn't to inform us. It's to get us interested enough to click on the article or read it in the newspaper or watch the segment on TV or whatever medium we're dealing with at that time. In many cases, you might find that the headline isn't what the article ends up being about, or the article comes to a completely different conclusion than what the headline suggested. Following an argument to its conclusion means we need to read the whole article. And then we should probably read more articles on that topic and read all of that too. To avoid assumptions, we need to make sure to spot contradictions and faulty logic in what we're reading. This means that we can see when things don't necessarily add up. I want to give you an example that may sound political, but it is also just part of current events. And I definitely don't want to draw any conclusions here. In fact, I'm specifically not going to draw any conclusions here, and you'll see why. But we've all heard a lot of debate about mask mandates and whether they prevent COVID. And we see graphs and charts about areas with and without these mandates. And I swear, I'll read an article that uses that information to tell me that, well, clearly the mandates work. And then I'll see that exact same chart in a different article that says, well, obviously the mandates don't work. So, wait, what? And look, from reading those couple articles, I honestly wouldn't know, even now, 3.5 years in, how well these mask mandates were working. Because I know people personally who wore them religiously to this day and have gotten COVID more times than people who don't wear them. But then I also know people who were one of the only people to wear masks at an event and then were one of the only people not to get COVID at that event. So there's all kinds of anecdotal stuff out there. It's really hard to filter through. And if you really think about it, to the degree that the mandates may or may not work, do we even know if the people who were being mandated were actually following the mandates? Were they wearing the mask correctly? We don't know any of that. So at that point, did the mandate work? Well, probably not. But is that because the masks don't work or because people didn't follow the mandates? It's impossible to know. But here's what I do know. Just like any other topic, conclusions about issues like that, especially hot button topics, which is why I wanted to bring one up, are often incomplete because our emotions get involved and we fail to remember that every situation is different. Appropriate distinctions must be drawn. To get back to that example, living in a New York City apartment building with a couple thousand other residents and riding the busy subway every day is likely to expose you more to anything, including COVID, than living on a farm and only seeing your close family. So there's a zillion factors that aren't taken into consideration. Maybe by the researchers they were, but usually not by the articles that we read about that research. So when the article concludes, oh yeah, it worked, or nah, it didn't work, and now that I think about it, I'm not even sure they ever defined what worked was supposed to mean. I want to make sure I understand the larger context of what I'm actually being told. Both of those articles that I mentioned are likely to have wanted me to assume that things were simple and easy to understand, so I would go along with their preference. Things are not simple, and well-researched conclusions are hardly ever extreme. I'm not going to say never, that would be an extreme thing too, but it's rare. You need to exercise foresight. In science and in any field of research, it's very dangerous to believe that you know everything there is to know about a situation, let alone presume you know everything that might ever be discovered about that situation. Foresight is the ability to look ahead and consider all the future possibilities, not pick one you believe will happen and assume that it will, but be open to whatever might arise as time goes on. In short, there's a really good chance bias has worked its way into a ton of the sources that we see, whether we're looking at a social media feed or a news app. I'm an Apple News guy. I don't even remember the last time I watched a news broadcast on TV. Some of you may never have, or wherever you get your news. So, what exactly is bias? How do we avoid it? It's a tricky thing because it's often present where we don't think to look for it, including in our own minds. Bias is defined as prejudice in favor of or against one thing, person, or group compared with another, usually in a way considered to be unfair. So, what makes this difficult is that we assume that this is always intentional and done by some particularly unpleasant people with a nasty agenda. But is that always true? Honestly, the fact is we all have certain biases, and they often have nothing to do with being a bad person or trying to do a bad thing. While it may be deliberate as a form of manipulation, it could just be accidental because the source didn't filter it out effectively. And that source could include ourselves. So we need to watch for bias in what we read. And let's bring this back to why we're here today. We need to watch for bias in how we react to what we read and in how we report out what we have read. Here are some ways that we can prevent our own biases sneaking into our writing, as well as how to avoid the appearance of bias, whether it's present or not, in our writing. One trick is to write in the third person, almost always. Now, I'm not saying I statements are always wrong. Sometimes in your story, you do need to talk about yourself, but avoiding them is usually the right way to go because most scholarly research is not about you personally. You should also usually avoid using the word you, because now you sound like you're preaching or writing a self help book. Yes, I'm doing a lot of I and you in this presentation, but this is in fact a presentation. It is not a written scholarly paper, and the rules are different. Avoid your personal feelings. Now, your personal feelings are valid. They should be factored in at some point. You need to acknowledge them, own them, figure out how they fit in. But they should not be the main reason you draw the conclusion you draw, and they should not be a big part of what you're writing about in most cases. That would be the dictionary definition of bias. Be specific. If there's a statistic you can use it. Don't say a lot or most or usually. If you can put a number on it, go ahead and put a number on it. Use people first language. Think about the subtle difference between these two things. If I call someone a disabled child versus a child with a disability, see how child with a disability is people first? They are, in fact, a child first. Their disability is not the definition of who they are. So it's better that the first word used to identify them isn't that. Think this isn't necessarily a form of bias, but it is a way to train our minds to avoid non inclusive, controversial, or even offensive language. Most importantly, because we don't want to actually do those things, but also because when we do them accidentally, it distracts from the point that we would like to be making. Just over the past few years, gender neutral phrases and pronouns have become much more acceptable in scholarly writing. It's gotten now to the point where we should consider avoiding gender specific pronouns and use things like they and them over he, she, her, him, because it's more inclusive. And this is a different issue. I'm not talking one way or another about a person's preferred pronouns. Okay, that's a whole different conversation. What we're talking about is when you're in general referring to individuals you're not identifying in written work, using they for that single person might have been counted wrong on standardized tests or not been included in style guides in the past, but they are now completely accepted. It's even in the Oxford Dictionary. It's okay to do this. In fact, it's preferred. It's also a really good way to keep someone's identity as concealed as possible when it's important to do that. So to wrap my section up, being informed means reading all the perspectives, even when you don't like them. It means looking at things you might or might not agree with or find particularly interesting in the first place in order to reach the kind of conclusions that can be trusted. For instance, if you've been given an assignment and the instructor provides you with a specific set of articles to read, the easy way, and you'd be following the rules, is if you just read what you were told to read. But a good rule of thumb is to still gather even more information to ensure you're getting the full picture. It's never a bad idea to read more. You'll never say to yourself, why did I bother being more informed? That was a waste of time. By the way, professors are always impressed with students who include more research in their paper than the readings that were provided in class. It shows initiative, it shows that you understand how to do a complex analysis, and it shows a willingness to work hard to improve that grade. All right, now with some advice on how to make sure those extra sources you're looking for are good ones, I'm going to hand this over to Jenna.
Thanks so much, Henry. So now that you have all learned how to identify assumptions and bias, let's take it a step further and discuss how to improve your writing by using evidence. So, first off, where can you find credible sources for your research? Many libraries, schools, and universities have electronic databases. So, look for a database link on your local library or school website. You can also check out ProQuest and ERIC for scholarly articles, or even look through the New York Times archives for historical resources. Also, consider the use of primary sources, meaning use the original document and not someone else's summary of it. If you read someone's summary of something and you think, wow, that's really good information, go and find that original source. And we'll talk a little bit more about how to do this in a few minutes. You'll also want to be sure to check the domain suffix. Sites ending in .edu or .gov are, in general, considered to be reliable sources. However, you do want to be aware of political sites, which can be used to sway public opinion. Use these sites with caution, checking for credibility and authority. Company websites generally end in .com, and these sites are great for information about a particular company. However, company websites are, of course, used to promote their business, so you'll want to be sure that any information you used is non-biased. While many professional organizations end in .org, there are also many .orgs that promote a specific agenda. So just make sure that you put on your critical thinking cap and read these sources with a focus on what information might be biased. Over the years, Wikipedia has become more reliable as a general source of information thanks to its large audience of readers and its rigorous editorial guidelines. But with that said, many educators still prefer you not cite it as a source within your paper. However, the references section of each Wikipedia entry is rich with source material. So to find it, you'll scroll all the way down to the bottom of an entry, and there you'll find a list of resources related to the topic with links to the sources themselves. This strategy is actually true of most resources. So if you find a good scholarly article, for example, go to its reference page or reference section and see if you can find additional article sources related to that topic. Use the titles, the journal titles, or the author as search terms in your online library or in Google Scholar. And if you've never tried Google Scholar, it's a great resource and database of research-based materials. So you'll want to check that out too. Also, be sure to check the dates of your source. If you're citing something that's more than 5 to 10 years old, it's probably no longer credible. Newer research has likely been done, the world has changed, and issues have changed. The only time that this is not applicable is when you're citing primary sources. You'll also want to examine the author's credentials. If you're not sure whether or not an author is a credible source, look them up. See what they do. Have they published other works? Is it easy to find information about them? If the answer to both of these questions is no, it's possible that the author is not credible. So how can you quickly determine if a source is not credible? Well, here are some signs to look out for. First, any opinion or op-ed pieces and editorials. Sources written in all caps, and explanation points. You'll want to look out for those. If a website seems primitive and not professional, it probably isn't. Now, this is an extreme example, but for example, if there is a website called Tom's website, it might be safe to assume that it's not credible. Also, look out for articles that are singular paragraph, and of course, if you sense any persuasion. The most important thing to remember is the big picture. Sometimes when we read articles for research, we can become narrowly focused on issues within issues, kind of like going down a rabbit hole. So try to remember the larger issue at hand so that you can help maintain perspective. Now, we've established how to find credible sources. Now let's talk about how to use them. After you introduce evidence into your writing or presentation, You must explain why and how the evidence supports your argument. In other words, you have to justify the significance of the evidence and its function in your paper. As writers, we sometimes assume that readers already know what we're talking about. We may even be wary of elaborating too much because we think the point is obvious. But the reality is that readers can't read our minds. They may be familiar with some of the ideas we discuss, but they can't know what points we try to make with those ideas unless we make them explicit through explanation, organization, transitions, and so forth. So aim to spell out any connections that you make between the evidence you choose and where you decide to include that evidence in your paper. Here are some brief questions to ask yourself when trying to determine where to include evidence. I've just stated this point, but so what? Why is it interesting? Why should anyone care? What does this information imply? What are the consequences of thinking this way or looking at a problem this way? I've just described what something is like or how I see it, but why is it like that? I've just said that something happens, so how does it happen? How does it come to be the way that it is? How is this idea related to my thesis? What connections exist between them? Does it support my thesis? And if so, how does it do that? And finally, can I give an example to illustrate this point? Now, all that said, how do you know when you have enough evidence? Well, every time you draw a conclusion, you'll want to check that you have the evidence to do so. If you don't, you probably need to gather more. Remember that every claim needs evidence. I usually conduct all of my research before I start to write or plan out a presentation. I like to have the big picture. What do I know? What am I going to say? And how do I back it all up with credible evidence? So if I'm trying to make a claim that there is no evidence to support, then I know that I am on the wrong track. This also helps me to check my own bias and assumptions before I even begin the writing process. Now, once I have all of that clearly defined, I start writing. Another consideration that you might consider is to color code your notes. When I color code my notes, I do it by paragraph because each paragraph is typically a new claim. So if my first paragraph is my first claim, I might color code all of my notes for that claim in blue. My second paragraph's notes might be in all purple, and my notes for my third paragraph might be all pink. Then when I look at my notes after I've finished up my research, I can easily see which paragraphs need some work. So for example, if I hardly have any pink in my notes, then I know that I might not have enough evidence to support my claim in my third paragraph and thus need to find some more. So you just learned how to find evidence and determine whether it's credible, but where does it actually belong in your writing? There's a very simple way to formulate each paragraph. Start with your claim. What's the point of your paragraph? Then use evidence to support it. What does the research tell you about it? What can you insert into your paragraph to really make your case? Then follow with reasoning. Reasoning is how you tie it together. Why is your evidence important, and how does it connect with your claim? Using evidence in your writing is a skill, and like any skill, it takes practice and it requires support. So if you need help finding sources or including evidence in your writing, Tutor.com's Writing Center has some really simple, easy to follow resources on a variety of writing topics. It's free and it's open for you to use anytime, so you'll want to be sure to check that out. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah, and she's going to share with you how to use critical thinking when it comes to artificial intelligence.
Thank you, Jenna. So we spent a good amount of time here identifying biases, outlining the research process, and discovering how to find and evaluate potential sources. So let's look at the intersection between critical thinking and artificial intelligence. First, revisit with me the checklist for critical thinking that Henry built with us earlier. It raises vital questions and problems. We want to be thinking about whether or not things make sense and bringing together the things that we hear in different sources. We want to gather and assess all of the information. We want to communicate that effectively. And we want it to be something that we have put together, not something that someone else has put together. I imagine some of you may be thinking to yourself, why does all this matter? Why do people need to do research anymore? Why bother with critical thinking? Can't AI do it all for us? And others of you may even be wondering, what in the world is AI? So let's start there. ChatGPT, a leader in automated simulation of human intelligence, had this to say about what AI is. AI, or artificial intelligence, refers to the simulation of human intelligence in machines, machines pretending to think like humans, allowing them to perform tasks that typically require human intelligence. This field of computer science focuses on developing algorithms, basically teaching the computer the patterns that normal human intelligence might follow, software and hardware that enables machines to exhibit qualities associated with human intelligence, like the ability to learn from past experience, the ability to reason or apply logic and problem solving, and natural language production. Notice that the emphasis here is on the developing of algorithms that enable machines to be perceived as having human intelligence. Those algorithms allow the computer to interpret language patterns and subsequently predict a reasonably appropriate next word. It's important to understand that that's how things like ChatGPT work. It's particularly adept at answering language-based questions where the answers are found in text. It's not capable of evaluating or producing images, and it's not particularly accomplished when it comes to things involving the laws of logic, like mathematical questions. But when it comes to language, it does a great job. But even within its language-based strengths, it has some limitations. So I asked ChatGPT to tell me about its limitations, and here's what came back. First, there's a knowledge cutoff. Interesting. So ChatGPT said, my training data only goes up until September of 2021. I do not have access to information or events that have occurred after that date. Nothing more interesting than that. Or sorry, more recent than that. It also lacks real-time information. It said, I do not have access to the internet or real-time data. Therefore, I cannot provide the most up-to-date information on current events, stock prices, or other rapidly changing data. Within a ChatGPT response, you may find inaccuracies. According to ChatGPT, I may generate responses that are factually incorrect or outdated. Users should verify information obtained from me from reliable sources, especially for critical decisions. So keep that in mind. ChatGPT is telling you to use critical thinking in evaluating what it produces. ChatGPT could also be sensitive to input. On this topic, it says, I can be sensitive to the input phrasing. A slight change in the way a question is asked can result in different responses, including nonsensical ones. That points back to those inaccuracies again. Repetition of response is another of ChatGPT's self-proclaimed limitations. It says, I may sometimes produce repetitive or redundant answers, especially in long conversations. Biases. One of the things Henry emphasized was the importance of avoiding biases in our work. Unfortunately, ChatGPT isn't the solution. What it says, like earlier AI models, I can inadvertently reflect and amplify biases present in the training data. OpenAI, the group of developers behind ChatGPT, has made efforts to reduce biases, but some biases may still exist. Oops, ChatGPT might even produce inappropriate content. It says, I am designed to avoid generating inappropriate or offensive content, but there may be instances where I produce content that violates guidelines. Eek. And because it is a computer, not a human. It lacks critical thinking. It says, I do not possess consciousness or critical thinking abilities. So right there, don't use ChatGPT to do your critical thinking for you. I generate responses based on patterns in the data and do not have independent understanding or judgment. What that means is what it is spitting out to you, it does not understand. It is simply following a pattern of language, and it has no comprehension of the things that it is producing. So if the purpose of research is to assimilate information through critical thinking, ChatGPT is not doing research. ChatGPT also has limits to its long-term coherence. The way it works is that you have various open conversations through which it maintains record of what you've talked about in that conversation. When you want to change the subject, you open a new conversation, but it's not infinite. ChatGPT says, while I can maintain context over a conversation, there are limits to the length of coherent and contextually relevant responses. So your conversation could go on long enough that it loses track of what you're actually talking about. And perhaps as no surprise, ChatGPT presents security concerns depending on what you share. Users should avoid sharing sensitive or personal information with AI models, as there may be security and privacy risks associated with AI interactions. If what you share has the potential for becoming part of the AI knowledge base, you need to exercise caution with what you share. And last, ChatGPT can't take responsibility for how you use it. So from ChatGPT, it says, users are responsible for how they use AI models like me. Ensuring that I am used ethically and responsibly is crucial to avoid harmful consequences. So that was a look at the limitations. Notice that these highlighted ones, the knowledge cutoff, the inaccuracies, the biases, the lack of critical thinking, these are all things that Henry and Jenna talked about, things that you need to focus on in doing critical thinking and research. If ChatGPT has these limitations, we need to be really careful about how we use it. It's not going to have recent information like Jenna talked about. It's going to have biases like Henry told us to avoid. And it's not able to do the critical thinking for us or necessarily produce completely accurate information like we would be able to do on our own if we pulled together the resources, read it for ourselves, and put it together with critical thinking and references to actual existing works. Let's move to a look at some of the best uses for ChatGPT. A significant challenge for many students is knowing where to start with their research. What sources can I use? Where are they? So I asked ChatGPT a couple of questions to find out what it could do to help us in this area. The first question I asked was, what sources can I use to write an essay about the mathematical influence of Pythagoras? What it returned was really helpful. First, it recommended several specific academic books, some search terms that might be helpful in academic databases, some web resources around the history of mathematics, a suggestion that I consider biographies or historical accounts, educational lectures, and museum exhibits. Crazy amount of stuff there. Also, what he wrote personally, and look at secondary and tertiary sources that have evaluated what he wrote. Be careful that those are not your main supporting evidence, but they can help you understand what you're reading in those primary sources. Specifically focused mathematical academic databases and looking to online course material that may also be able to shed some light on his life or influence. Here again, with things you find on YouTube, use critical thinking when considering the credibility of the source. Overall, a great set of suggestions, more or less catered to the topic I'm trying to write on. When I asked for specific sources, it gave me a big list, several books, some journal articles, some online encyclopedias, and even a museum exhibit to check out. So as you can see, this can be a great starting point for the research process, helping me figure out where to go next. The second question I asked was, how can I find reputable journal articles? This is a struggle a lot of students face when they're trying to start their research. Jenna covered a lot of this in her discussion on finding credible resources. So this is a look at how ChatGPT can help us do that legwork and possibly narrow down where to look. So here's what ChatGPT presented as the response to my question. It suggested specific academic databases and provided search tips and information on how to use filters to get exactly what I'm looking for. Reading journal article abstracts is a great way to have a sense of what you're going to get out of the article before you invest the time into reading it. Your school or local library likely has access to many reputable journals or subscriptions on databases that are cost prohibitive on the individual level, so take advantage of those resources. And ChatGPT suggests looking into the sources used for the article you're reading, like what Jenna said, provides some ways to evaluate the credibility of the journal and the article's author, and caution about journals that don't meet academic standards. Then don't forget about interlibrary loan. This is a program by which your school or local library can borrow from other institutions in your city, in your state, or even elsewhere in the nation. Just be sure that you start the research process early because those sometimes are hard copy sources that need to be shipped, and that can take time. So there we have yet another use for ChatGPT that will not put you into the realm of plagiarism. It is simply being used as an advanced search engine and guide to your research process, rather than a generator of your research itself. We are going to continue our conversation about source credibility and the use of AI in our next session in 2 weeks, so be sure to register for that. We'd love to see you there. With that, I'm going to hand it back to Maxine for some Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, so before we do get to Q&A, there are just a couple of things that I want to mention. One, we do have a YouTube channel, and on that YouTube channel are all of our previous webinars. So that is definitely something that if you ever want to learn more about some of the topics that we've covered today, or just see what other webinars we've done in the past, if you go to tutor.com/YouTube webinars, you'll be able to go through all of those. And we have years worth of webinars available for you. Additionally, we do recommend following us on Facebook and Instagram. That way, you can kind of be aware of some of the different webinars and events that are going to be coming up in the near future. So, as Sarah mentioned, we have one coming up in 2 weeks on academic integrity. But if you follow us on Instagram or Facebook, you'll be able to see when our next student success series is, or any other webinars that we have planned. But now for the Q&A. It does look like we got a couple of questions and we have some time to go through them. The first one was, how can you tell a primary source from a secondary source? And in what situations can they be useful?
Yeah, I'll take that. So a primary source is a source that is written as its own research, or written by the actual person. So let's take my example of Pythagoras that we put into ChatGPT. Anything written by Pythagoras about the mathematical world, anything he may have written about geometry in particular or trigonometry, would be a primary source. He wrote about it. He was learning about it. He presented his findings. A secondary source would be some more current mathematician, for example, providing a summary or analysis of what Pythagoras said. That would be not their own research findings in the area of math, but simply summarizing what someone else did. Using a primary source is important in doing your own research because you're not compiling other people's thoughts into your thing. You're taking the original data, if that makes sense. A good reason to use a secondary source is to help you interpret that primary source. Pythagoras lived a long time ago, and people talked differently a long time ago and wrote differently a long time ago. Using a 20 or 21st century mathematician's explanation of what Pythagoras said could help to that you could apply that to what Pythagoras said and have a better understanding to then be able to take what Pythagoras wrote and use it in your research.
Awesome. Thank you. And kind of on the topic of primary sources, someone wrote in saying that primary sources can be difficult to track down and can sometimes require lots of subscriptions. What do you suggest and kind of what tools do you suggest or how do you suggest accessing things like that?
That's a great question. The biggest thing that I can suggest is taking advantage of institutional subscriptions, any institution that you have access to. When I did research in graduate school, I used my university's librarian to say, this is what I'm looking for. I'm not finding it here. And she would help me find things available online. There are a lot of journals that have gone online. And so, with subscriptions that the university paid for, I was able to access the things I wanted. I also used my local public library's librarian for things that I couldn't find through the university or just trying to get a different set of resources. Both of those were also able to help me with interlibrary loan. I remember several resources that I borrowed. I live in Southern Colorado. Several resources that I borrowed from the University of Northern Colorado because they had those resources in their stacks. And through interlibrary loan, they were able to hook me up with those and have them shipped down to me so that I could use those in my research. So that I just take full advantage of all those things that are available to you, the libraries, the librarians, the institutions that can afford the subscriptions that the individuals can't.
All right. It looks like we have another question that came in, which is kind of interesting. So today we talked a lot about the benefits of critical thinking, but are there any situations where critical thinking can be harmful or overcomplicate something, or is there no downside to critical thinking?
I guess it depends on the urgency of action, right? Um, there is a point at which things can be overthought, and I think that's probably where you're going with this question. Um, Sometimes you do have to act on the information at hand, and that could be if you imagine like in an emergency room and you don't know the patient's entire medical history, it can be dangerous to make any decision you might want to make. However, making no decision at all is the worst thing you can do, right? So yes, there are time sensitive situations in which one has to simply run with the information that one has, regardless of whether in a perfect world with all the time in the world, that would be considered complete information. And I think there are times that people do that in real life, even when it's not as time sensitive, right? There are times where we've gathered so much information that we're hesitant to move forward because we're just saddled with all of these options and it's hard to make a decision, right? There's all kinds of psychological things to get into on that. So in the broad sense, yes, there are times in which critical thinking has run its course and we have to move on to the next step, which is to take whatever action we think is best based on the information that we have.
Awesome. Thank you. We did get two more questions, and then I think that will be about all the time that we have. One person was asking about the PowerPoint. We will be sending out, in addition to that recording, a full slide deck. So you will have access to all the links that we talked about, the resources, as well as this main page. So if you need to take a picture of that, by all means, please do. And then one last question, which actually I can take for one of the first times in these series, is will you be able to get one-to-one tutoring on tutor.com? And that's a great question. Chances are, if you're here, you heard about it through your institution, whether that is your higher ed institution, your library, something like that. And if so, you should definitely reach out to them to see if you have access to tutor.com because we do provide one-to-one tutoring. But it looks like that is those are all the questions that we've gotten today. So again, thank you so much for everybody for joining us today. I hope you found some of this information helpful. Again, a recording is going to be sent out, as well as some additional information on that next webinar that is coming up. So thank you so much and have a wonderful rest of your day.